LORAN, short for long-range navigation, was a hyperbolic radio navigation system developed in the United States during World War II. It was similar to the UK's G system but operated at lower frequencies in order to provide improved range up to 1,500 miles with accuracy of tens of miles. It was first used for ship convoys crossing the Atlantic Ocean and then by long-range patrol aircraft, but found its main use on the ships and aircraft operating in the Pacific theater. LORAN, in its original form, was an expensive system to implement, requiring a cathode ray tube display. This limited use to the military and large commercial uses. Use was never widespread, and by the time new receivers were available in the 1950s, the same improved electronics led to new systems with higher accuracy. The U.S. Navy began development of LORAN B, which offered accuracy on the order of a few tens of feet, but ran into significant technical problems. The U.S. Air Force had worked on a different concept, known as cyclone, which the Navy took over as LORAN C. LORAN C offered longer range than LORAN and accuracy of hundreds of feet. The U.S. Coast Guard took over operations of both systems in 1958. In spite of the dramatically improved performance of LORAN C, LORAN, now known as LORAN-It, would become much more popular during this period. This was due largely to the large numbers of surplus LORAN units released from the Navy as ships and aircraft replaced the sets with LORAN C. The widespread introduction of inexpensive microelectronics during the 1980s caused LORAN C receivers to drop in price dramatically, and LORAN A use began to rapidly decline. LORAN A was dismantled starting in the 1970s. It remained active in North America until 1980 and the rest of the world until 1985. A Japanese chain remained on the air until the 9th of May 1997, and a Chinese chain was still listed as active as of 2000. LORAN A used the same frequencies as the amateur radio 160-meter band, and radio operators were under strict rules to operate at reduced power levels, depending on the location and distance to the shore. U.S. operators were limited to maximums of 200 to 500 watts during the day and 50 to 200 watts at night. History. At the 1st of October 1940 meeting of the U.S. Army Signal Corps Technical Committee, Alfred Loomis, chair of the Microwave Committee, proposed building a hyperbolic navigation system. He predicted that such a system could provide an accuracy of at least 1,000 feet at a range of 200 miles, and a maximum range of 300 to 500 miles for high-flying aircraft. This led to the Precision Navigational Equipment for Guiding Airplanes specification, which was sent back to the Microwave Committee and formed up as Project 3. Orders for initial systems were sent out at a follow-up meeting on the 20th of December 1940. Edward George Bowen, developer of the first airborne radar systems, was also at the 20th of December meeting, and stated that he was aware of similar work in the UK, but didn't know enough about it to offer any suggestions. Project 3 moved to the newly formed Radiation Laboratories Navigation Group in 1941. Early systems operated around 30 MHz, but it was later decided to try experiments with different equipment that could be tuned from 3 to 8 MHz. These lower frequency systems were found to be much more stable electronically. After first considering setting up transmitters on mountain peaks, the team instead settled on two abandoned Coast Guard stations at Montauk Point, New York, and Fenwick Island. Plant, Delaware. On the receiving end, a station wagon was fitted with a simple receiver and sent around the country looking for solid signals, which were found as far away as Springfield, Missouri. For a production system, the team began working with the system using a circular J-scope display for improved accuracy. A J-scope presents time differences not as a linear displacement across the tube, as in the more common A-scope, but instead as the angle around the cathode ray tube's face. Times differences could be represented with a longer length for a given display size, improving accuracy. In spite of using the J-scope and adopting the frequency change for more stability, the team found accurate measurements of range quite difficult. At the time, the procedure for generating sharp pulses of signals was in its infancy, and the signals were considerably spread out in time, making measurements difficult. By this time, the team had become aware of the UK's G efforts, and were aware that G used a system of electronically generated strobes that produced pips on the display that were accurately aligned with system timing. They sent a team to the UK to learn about the strobe concept, and immediately adopted it for the work. But as part of this exchange, the Project 3 team found that G was almost identical to their own system in concept and desired performance. Unlike the system, G had largely completed development and was proceeding to production. The decision was made to abandon the current efforts, use G on their own aircraft, and redevelop the system for the long-range role instead. LORAN. The decision to switch to the long-range role meant that the high accuracy of the G system was not needed, which greatly reduced the need to address the timing problems. This change in purpose also demanded the use of lower frequencies, which could reflect off the ionosphere at night and thus provide over-the-horizon operation. Two frequency bands were initially selected, 1.85 and 1.95 MHz for nighttime use, and 7.5 MHz. The 7.5 MHz, labeled HF on early receivers, was never used operationally. In mid-1942, Robert Dippy, the lead developer of the G system of the Telecommunications Research Establishment, was sent to the US for 8 months to help with LORAN development. At the time, the project was being driven primarily by Captain Harding of the US Navy, and they were concentrating entirely on a shipboard system. Dippy convinced them that an airborne version was definitely possible, leading to some interest by the US Army Air Force. The Navy was unhappy about this turn of events. Dippy also instituted a number of simple changes that would prove extremely useful in practice. Among these, he outright demanded that the airborne LORAN receivers be built physically similar to the G receivers, so that they could be swapped out in service simply by replacing the receiver unit. This would prove extremely useful. RAF Transport Command aircraft could swap the receivers when moving to or from the Australian theatre. Dippy also designed the ground station timing equipment. It was around this time that the project was joined by both the U.S. Coast Guard and the Royal Canadian Navy. The project was still top secret at this time, and little actual information was shared, especially with the Coast Guard. The Canadian liaison was required, as ideal siting for the stations would require several stations in various locations in Canadian maritime provinces. One site in Nova Scotia proved to be a battle. The site was owned by a fisherman whose domineeringly total wife was dead set against having anything to do with the sinful Navy men. When the site selection committee of J.A. Waldschmidt and L.T. CDMR, Argyle were discussing the matter with the husband, a third visitor arrived and he offered the men cigarettes. They refused, and the hostess then asked if they drank. When they said they did not, the land was quickly secured. LORAN was soon ready for deployment, and the first chain went live in June 1942 at Monteconfennic. This was joined shortly thereafter by 2 stations in Newfoundland, at Bonavista and Battle Harbour, and then by 2 stations in Nova Scotia, at Baccaro and Deming Island. Additional stations all along the US and Canadian East Coast were installed through October, and the system was declared operational in early 1943. By the end of that year, additional stations had been installed in Greenland, Iceland, the Faroe Islands and the Hebrides, offering continuous coverage across the North Atlantic. RAF Coastal Command had another station installed on the Shetlands, offering coverage over Norway, a major staging ground for German U-boats and capital ships. Expansion. The enormous distances and lack of useful navigation points in the Pacific Ocean led to widespread use of LORAN for both ships and aircraft during the Pacific War. In particular, the accuracy offered by LORAN allowed aircraft to reduce the amount of extra fuel they would otherwise have to carry to ensure they could find the base after a long mission. This reduced fuel load allowed the bomb load to be increased. By the end of World War II, there were 72 LORAN stations, with over 75,000 receivers in use. Additional chains in the Pacific were added in the post-war era. A spurt in construction followed the opening of the Korean War, including new chains in Japan and one at Busan, Korea. Chains were also installed in China prior to the ultimate end of the Chinese Communist Revolution, and these stations remained on the air at least into the 1990s. A final major expansion took place in Portugal and the Azores in 1965, offering additional coverage to the mid-Atlantic. SSLORAN. During early experiments with LORAN's skywaves, Jack Pierce noticed that at night the reflective layer in the ionosphere was quite stable. This led to the possibility that 2 LORAN stations could be synchronized using skywave signals, at least at night, allowing them to be separated over much greater distances. Accuracy of a hyperbolic system is a function of the baseline distance, so if the stations could be spread out, the system would become more accurate, so fewer stations would be needed. A test system was first attempted on the 10th of April 1943 between the LORAN stations at Fenwick and Bonavista, 1,100 miles away. This test demonstrated accuracy of 1/2 mile, significantly better than normal LORAN. This led to a second round of tests in late 1943, this time using 4 stations: Montic, East Brewster, Emmett, Gooseberry Falls, Moe, and Key West, FL. Extensive evaluation flights revealed an average error of 1 to 2 miles. The nighttime mode of operation was a perfect fit for RAF Bomber Command. The 4 test stations were dismantled and shipped across the Atlantic and reinstalled to form 2 chains: Aberdeen Bizerta and Doran Benghazi, known as Skywave Synchronized LORAN, or SSLORAN. The system provided coverage anywhere south of Scotland and as far east as Poland with an average accuracy of 1 mile. The system was used operationally in October 1944, and by 1945 it was universally installed in No. 5 Group RAF. The same basic concept was also tested post-war by the Coast Guard in a system known as Skywave Long Baseline LORAN. The only difference was the selection of different frequencies: 10.585 MHz in the day and at 2 MHz at night. Initial tests were carried out in May 1944 between Chatham, MA, and Fernandina, FL, and a second set between Hobe Sound, FL, and Point Chinato, Puerto Rico, in December to January 1945-46. The system was not put into operation due to a lack of suitable frequency allocations. LORAN B and CLORAN was a simple system that compared the arrival times of pulses to make measurement. Ideally, perfectly formed rectangular blips would be displayed on the court, whose leading edge could be compared with accuracy. In practice, the transmitters cannot turn on and off instantly, and due to a variety of factors, the resulting blips are spread out in time. Adding to this is the fact that the shape of the resulting blip, the envelope, depends on the frequency of the system, meaning the lower frequency systems like LORAN will generally have less accuracy than higher frequency ones like G. There is an entirely different way to accomplish the same timing measurement, not by comparing the timing of the pulse envelopes, but timing the phase of the signals. This is actually quite easy to do in electronics, and can be displayed directly using a simple mechanical pointer. The trick to such a system is to ensure the master and slave stations are phase coherent, which was an expensive and complex proposition during World War II. But by isolating the expensive portions of the system at the few broadcast stations, the Decca navigation system using this technique went active in 1944, offering accuracy similar to G but using low-cost mechanical displays which were also much easier to use. The downside to the phase comparison system is that it is not possible to know from a continuous wave signal, like Decca's, which part of the signal you are measuring. You could be comparing the first waveform from one station to the first from another, but the second waveform looks identical. This leads to a problem where the operator can generate an accurate measurement, but the actual fix might be at a wide variety of locations. Decca referred to these as lanes, and used a mechanical system to keep track of them. By combining the two concepts, both of these problems could be eliminated. Since phase comparison is generally more accurate at low frequencies, taking accurate fixes would be based on this technique. But instead of broadcasting a continuous signal, as in the case of Decca, the signal would be in the form of pulses. These would be used to make a rough fix using the same technique as G or LORAN, positively identifying the lane, and then a phase comparison would be used to take a more accurate measurement. The only problem from a development standpoint would be selecting frequencies that allowed reasonably accurate pulse envelopes while still having measurable waveforms within the pulses, as well as developing displays capable of showing both the pulses as a whole and the waves within them. These concepts led to experiments with low-frequency LORAN in 1945, using a much lower frequency, 180 kHz. A system with 3 transmitters was set up on the U.S. East Coast using long antennas supported by balloons. The experiments demonstrated that the inaccuracy inherent to the design while working at such low frequencies was simply too great to be useful. Operational factors introduced errors that overwhelmed the capabilities. Nevertheless, the 3 transmitters were reinstalled in northern Canada and Alaska for experiments in polar navigation, and ran for 3 years until shutting down again in March 1950. These experiments demonstrated accuracy on the order of 0.15 microseconds, or about 50 meters, a great advance over LORAN. Maximum usable range was 1,000 miles over land and 1,500 miles on the sea. Using cycle matching, the system demonstrated an accuracy of 160 feet at 750 miles. But it was also discovered that the system was very difficult to use and the measurements remained subject to confusion over which cycles to match. During this same period, the U.S. Army Air Force became interested in a very high accuracy system for bombing pinpoint targets. Raytheon won a contract to develop a system called SITAC, which used the same basic techniques as LFLORAN. but included considerable automation to handle the timing internally without operator intervention. This proved to be extremely successful, with test runs placing the aircraft within 10 yards of the target. As the mission changed from short-range tactical bombing to over-the-pole nuclear delivery, the U.S. Air Force lost interest in the concept. Nevertheless, they continued experimentation with the equipment after adapting it to work on LFLORAN frequencies and renaming it Cyclin, lowering accuracy compared to the original, but providing reasonable accuracy on the order of a mile at greatly increased distances. The Navy had also been experimenting with a similar concept during this period, but using a different method to extract the timing. This system, later known as LORAN-B, ran into significant problems. In 1953, the Navy took over the Cyclin system and began a wide series of studies ranging as far away as Brazil, demonstrating accuracy to about 100 meters. The system was declared operational in 1957, and operations of LORAN and Cyclin were handed to the U.S. Coast Guard in 1958. At the time, the original LORAN became LORAN-A, a standard LORAN, and the new system became LORAN-C. Commercial use, decommissioning. In spite of the greatly increased accuracy and ease of use of LORAN-C, LORAN-A remained in widespread use. This was due largely to two important factors. One was that the electronics needed to read a LORAN-C signal were complex, and in the era of tube-based electronics, physically very large, generally fragile, and expensive. Further, as military ships and aircraft moved from LORAN-A to LORAN-C, the older receivers were made surplus. These older units were snapped up by commercial fishermen and other users, keeping it in widespread service. The introduction of transistorized radios, and then microcontroller-based systems that decoded the location directly, continued to improve LORAN-A systems while prices dropped. By the early 1970s, such units were relatively common, although they remained relatively expensive compared to devices like a radio direction finder. But the improvement of electronics through this period was so rapid that it was only a few years before LORAN-C units of similar size and cost were available. This led to the decision to open LORAN-C to civilian use in 1974. By the late 1970s, the Coast Guard was in the midst of phasing out LORAN-A in favor of additional LORAN-C chains. The Aleutian and Hawaii chains shut down on the 1st of July 1979, the remaining Alaska and West Coast chains on the 31st of December 1979, followed by the Atlantic and Caribbean transmitters on the 31st of December 1980. Several foreign chains in both the Pacific and Atlantic followed suit, and by 1985 most of the original chains were no longer operational. Japanese systems remained on the air longer, until 1991, serving the fishing fleet. Chinese systems were active into the 1990s before the replacement with more modern systems, and the 9 chains were still listed as active in Volume 6 of the Admiralty List of Radio Signals.